For more on this story now, we are joined by our SABC News reporter Khayelihle Khumalo. He joins us now in studio. And Trump imposed a 31% tariff on the US imports from South Africa on Wednesday. When he announced a 10% baseline tariff on all imports, higher targeted duties on dozens of countries, I want to know from you, when we heard this response now coming in from the South African government, one would say, would we have expected this kind of response? Because a number of countries are also countering some of the US's tariffs. And when it comes to Pretoria, they've really maintained some of these tariff hikes.
Well, certainly, Mbali, especially because I think Minister Dawo of Trade, Industry and Competition said they kind of really had a bit of an understanding that, you know, such developments may happen. But for South Africa, they say it won't be ideal for them to have any countermeasures because they are still awaiting for a comprehensive reports from the US in terms of this 30% or the 31%, because now that's the figure that has been revised. It's 31%. But also in the main, what is critical for South Africa is that sectors like agriculture, you know, also automotive industry, you know, you look at a province like the Eastern Cape, which is really just mainly anchored under the automotive sector. So there's a bit of a massive concern about the jobs that are at stake, but also for South Africa, they say they will continue to engage with the US. But also in terms of the blueprint going forward, for example, they say it's quite important to diversify relations with so many countries. For example, they're looking at extending relations with so many countries right here in the African continent through the African Continental Free Trade Area, but also instruments like issues around the value-added goods, you know, as opposed to just relying on raw materials. But also what is very critical as well is that there are some exemptions in this regard. For example, around the pharmaceutical products, around the critical minerals, which is a very core market for South Africa.
One will also ask then, Khayelihle, when it comes to tariffs, you know, the question always remains, what happens to AGOA?
Well, in as far as the two ministers are concerned, they were saying it's essentially nullified. I mean, from 2000, this has been a very key instrument, allowing so many goods from sub-Saharan Africa to access the US market. I mean, you have a country like Lesotho that has been slapped with over 50% of these tariffs. So we do understand Lesotho is going to send a delegation to Washington, D.C. to try and explain to them the implications, the job losses, the factories that will shut down, especially their textile that has been relying on AGOA. But for South Africa, obviously, I mean, the strained relations, I think it's always been just a major issue that, you know, this is really up in the air, especially given this tension, the expulsion of our ambassador from the US, Ibrahim Rasool. Now the process of trying to smooth the relations. We do understand South Africa is going to have a special envoy who's going to go to the US prior to the appointment of the new ambassador.
At the same time, Khayelihle, very important is the impact this will have on South Africa's economy. Just earlier on, you also even touching on the issue of jobs. This will have dire implications, right, for the South African economy?
Well, undoubtedly, Mbali, especially because, I mean, it's a very fragile economy, albeit a fairly industrialized economy in sub-Saharan Africa, especially because we're talking about recovering, you know, COVID-19. Some sectors are still really trying to just come into line in light of those challenges that you've had. But also what is key for South Africa is that they will continue to open a room of engagement with the US, especially because they say that these tariffs are fairly punitive for so many sectors. So it calls for concern, so requiring that concerted efforts in terms of them reaching out to Washington, especially because they do say that when you look at the goods that are going to the US, they're not really constituting any threats.
South African government also saying there that while they face these difficulties with the US and its trade, at the same time also talking about strengthening its relations with other countries.
Well, very much so, especially in Bali. I mean, we saw recently with the Deputy President, Paul Mashatile, going to Japan. So they say that was one of the strategies for South Africa to expand, to deepen trade relations with other countries, as opposed to relying from the US. But they still do insist, you know, the US is quite a very important partner. This is the second largest trading partner for South Africa. You have over 600 American companies based here in South Africa. But also what is very clear is that it is a mutually beneficial relationship. The US, they're benefiting from South Africa. You do have some South African companies based in the US, your Sasol and many others as well. So they do insist that it's quite important to ensure that you don't lose this key partner.
A number of people also thinking that this only means it's because of the problems South Africa faces when it comes to the US. But this is across the board, right? It's not just South Africa that has seen these major tariff hikes.
You're right, Mbali, and especially because with Minister Pakstow for Trade, Industry and Competition, that's a point he was emphasizing, saying that it's just not about South Africa, but from time to time you do get South African exceptionalism where people oftentimes they want to zone in and narrow the issue. But this is a global issue. You know, for example, whether you're a US ally, whether you are as far as somewhere in Australia or some of the islands occupied by penguins, they're also being affected by the baseline tariff, and a lot of people are saying the markets are rattled. There are far-reaching implications. But obviously, I mean, you do have the powerful economies like China, for example, where they've slapped back the US with over 34% of tariffs. So those are very well-established economies that really do have the know-how and also the capacity where they can afford to do that, as opposed to the fragile economies. But quite a very sad day, especially for sub-Saharan Africa in particular. But it's a massive challenge, Bali, for South Africa, especially because we know it's under the G20 presidencies, so there's quite a lot of expectations, and a lot of countries, they say that institutions like WTO should really come on board and fix this particular issue.
Khayelihle, thank you so much for your time. That's our reporter there, Khayelihle Khumalo, just giving us an update in terms of that press briefing in which we saw earlier today, talking about something that has been on the lips of many South Africans when it comes to those tariff hikes imposed by the US government.